Understand the most disturbing breeding practices of Spartan society, it is essential first to grasp the unique and extreme nature of Sparta itself. Unlike the other Greek city-states, Sparta was not primarily concerned with trade, culture, or philosophy. It existed as a militarized state, an ecosystem in which every aspect of life revolved around the preparation for war and the maintenance of military dominance. From the moment a Spartan child was born, or even before, they were regarded not as an individual with personal rights or desires, but as a potential contribution to the strength and survival of the state. This overarching philosophy informs every discussion of Spartan breeding practices, revealing a society where human life was subjected to the cold calculus of eugenics and social engineering centuries before such terms existed. Sparta, situated in the region of Laconia in the southeastern Peloponnese, was a society of remarkable contrasts. The Spartiates, the full citizens, were elite warriors whose lives were entirely devoted to military excellence. Below them were the perioikoi, free inhabitants who engaged in trade and craftsmanship but were denied full citizenship, and the helots, an enslaved population primarily responsible for agricultural labor. This rigid social hierarchy was more than just a system of governance. It was a reflection of Sparta's obsession with strength, discipline, and survival. Every Spartan, from birth to death, existed to serve the needs of the state, and this collective priority over individual welfare extended into the most intimate areas of life, reproduction, and family. From the perspective of modern sensibilities, Spartan society appears shocking, almost dystopian. The Spartan state treated human life as a commodity measured by its utility to the military machine. Unlike Athens, which valued intellectual and artistic achievement, or Corinth, which thrived on commerce and luxury, Sparta's raison d'etre was the creation of warriors. This singular focus on martial prowess shaped the cultural values and social policies of the city. Spartans were trained from early childhood to endure hardship, to suppress personal emotion, and to prioritize the collective over the individual. It is within this context that the breeding practices, harsh, calculated, and ruthless, take on their full meaning. They were not arbitrary acts of cruelty, but deliberate strategies aimed at ensuring the survival and superiority of Sparta as a state. The education of Spartan children, or agoge, begins to illuminate how deeply the state was involved in shaping not just citizens, but genetically robust warriors. Boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 and placed in state-run training camps, where they underwent intense physical and psychological conditioning. The agoge instilled in them not only martial skills, but also a mindset that accepted and even revered discipline, pain, and the elimination of weakness. This cultural backdrop is crucial. The same philosophy applied to reproduction. Just as the state molded children into warriors, it sought to mold future generations before birth, ensuring that only the strongest and fittest would be brought into the world. This systemic approach to human life meant that Spartan breeding practices were as much about statecraft as they were about family. Another factor that distinguishes Spartan society is the role of women, which, in many ways, was unprecedented in the ancient world. Unlike in most Greek city-states, Spartan women were encouraged to be physically strong, educated in fitness and household management, and socially confident. This was not a gesture of egalitarianism, it was a practical strategy. Strong women were considered essential for producing healthy, capable offspring who could become future warriors. Marriage, childbirth, and motherhood were not simply private affairs, they were civic duties. Every Spartan woman was expected to contribute to the state's survival by producing children of the highest possible physical and mental quality. This unique role of women set the stage for the extreme breeding practices that would follow, framing procreation as a matter of national importance rather than personal choice or affection. The obsession with physical fitness and strength extended to the evaluation of infants from the moment they were born. Historical accounts suggest that newborns were examined by elders who assessed their physical condition and potential for contributing to the state. Those deemed weak, deformed, or otherwise unfit were abandoned, a practice known as exposure. Infants who failed this test were left on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, a stark reminder that Sparta placed collective survival above the life of any individual. While abhorrent by modern standards, this practice was consistent with the Spartan philosophy of prioritizing the state over the individual. It also reflects the methodical and almost clinical way in which Spartans approached reproduction. It was not a matter of love or personal fulfillment, but of producing citizens capable of fulfilling a singular goal: military excellence. This early form of population control was complemented by carefully orchestrated reproductive expectations later in life. Marriages in Sparta were arranged with an eye toward producing strong offspring. The state encouraged unions between physically fit individuals, and the notion of romantic love was secondary, if considered at all. In some cases, older men would select young women based on their physical appearance and perceived genetic potential, a practice that, while shocking today, underscores the utilitarian nature of Spartan society. Every choice, from the selection of a mate to the treatment of infants, was governed by the same principle: the strength and continuity of the Spartan warrior class. In addition to these social and cultural pressures, religion and ritual also played a role in reinforcing Spartan reproductive policies. Religious festivals, such as the Gymnopedia, celebrated physical prowess and endurance, reinforcing the ideal of bodily perfection. Marriage ceremonies and associated rituals often included symbolic gestures emphasizing fertility, strength, and the continuity of the state. In essence, every dimension of Spartan life, from education to ritual to daily social practice, was integrated into a system designed to produce and maintain a population of physically superior warriors. Sparta's militarized and reproductive culture had profound psychological implications. Citizens were raised to view human life through the lens of utility and function. Emotional bonds were often subordinated to civic duty, and the normalization of harsh treatment of the weak permeated the collective mindset. The result was a society both feared and admired in the ancient world, a city-state that could field disciplined, fearless soldiers capable of extraordinary feats, yet one whose methods of sustaining itself were morally unsettling to contemporaries and nearly inconceivable today. The state's obsession with strength and efficiency created a feedback loop in which the breeding and upbringing of future warriors became inseparable from the very identity of Sparta itself. Finally, understanding the broader geopolitical context helps explain why the Spartans adopted such extreme measures. Surrounded by rival city-states and facing constant threats of rebellion from the Helot population, Sparta needed a steady supply of physically formidable citizens. The survival of the state was not guaranteed, and every policy, no matter how brutal, was justified by the existential need to maintain military dominance. Spartan breeding practices, therefore, were not merely cultural quirks. They were strategic imperatives, designed to preserve one of the most formidable armies of the ancient world. In conclusion, the introduction to Spartan society reveals a civilization unlike any other in ancient Greece. Its obsession with military excellence shaped every aspect of life, from education and family structures to marriage and procreation. Human life was subordinated to the needs of the state, and this philosophy extended to the most intimate and personal acts: childbirth, mate selection, and the raising of children. By understanding this context, we gain insight into the rationale behind Sparta's most disturbing breeding practices. Far from being random acts of cruelty, they were deliberate, systematic, and integral to the identity of a society that placed the survival and strength of the state above all else. Even above the most basic human impulses of love, compassion, and familial attachmento fully grasp the disturbing nature of Spartan society, one must examine its approach to the very beginning of life, childbirth and infancy. Unlike most other Greek city-states, Sparta did not regard infants as inherently valuable as individuals. Instead, a newborn's worth was determined almost exclusively by their potential contribution to the state. From the moment of birth, a Spartan child was subjected to scrutiny, testing, and a set of cold utilitarian policy that would be shocking to modern sensibilities. These practices were not intended to punish or harm arbitrarily. They were deeply intertwined with the militaristic philosophy that dominated every aspect of Spartan life. Spartan women, whose role was unusually prominent in comparison to other Greek societies, bore a tremendous responsibility. The state relied on them to produce strong and healthy children who could become the warriors and mothers of future generations. Pregnancy was therefore not only a personal and familial matter, but a civic duty. Expectant mothers were expected to maintain physical fitness, demonstrating strength and resilience that could be inherited by their children. Accounts suggest that Spartan women engaged in athletic training, gymnastics, and rigorous physical activity even during pregnancy, a stark contrast to contemporary norms in other Greek city-states where women were largely confined to domestic spaces and protected from physical exertion. The emphasis on maternal strength underscores how central the health and fitness of the mother were to the Spartan vision of an ideal citizen. The birth of a child was not a private familial event, it was heavily influenced by the state. Infants were immediately subjected to inspection by elders, typically members of the Gerousia, the council of older Spartan men. These elders evaluated newborns for signs of physical weakness, deformity, or other traits considered undesirable for the development of a strong warrior class. The criteria were harsh and precise. Any infant who appeared frail, malformed, or unlikely to thrive was condemned to a practice known as exposure. In this process, the child was abandoned, sometimes left on the slopes of Mount Taygetus or other designated locations, to die from the elements, predators, or starvation. This policy of infant exposure was not an isolated incident, but a systemic component of Spartan society. Historical sources such as Plutarch describe the procedure with chilling clarity. The elders would inspect the newborns, and those deemed unfit were removed from their families with no recourse. While this practice may seem barbaric, within the context of Sparta, it was rationalized as necessary for the survival of the state. In a society where military strength was paramount, the presence of weak or unhealthy individuals was considered a liability, both biologically and socially. The survival of the fittest was institutionalized from birth, and morality was subordinated to civic necessity. The psychological and cultural impact of this practice on Spartan families cannot be overstated. Mothers, despite their strong societal status, were expected to accept the possibility that their child might be deemed unfit and discarded. The bond between parent and child was heavily mediated by state expectations, with emotional attachment secondary to civic duty. This detachment was cultivated intentionally. It ensured that Spartan citizens internalized the prioritization of collective survival over personal affection. Unlike in other societies, where the family is the primary unit of care and emotional support, in Sparta, the state claimed authority over life and death at the earliest stage of existence. Even among infants who survived the initial inspection, life was far from free of pressure. The survival of a newborn was not only a triumph of health and vigor, but also a responsibility. Families were expected to nurture children in a way that maximized their physical, intellectual, and moral potential as future citizens. Mothers played an active role in instilling resilience and toughness, reinforcing the ideals of Spartan strength from infancy. Children were encouraged to be independent, fearless, and disciplined, beginning the long socialization process that would eventually culminate in the agoj, the rigorous military education system. Survival itself was a test, and the early experiences of Spartan infants reflected the uncompromising standards imposed by society. The rationale for these extreme practices becomes clearer when viewed in the broader context of Spartan demographics and military needs. Sparta was a relatively small city-state with a high proportion of enslaved helots who greatly outnumbered the Spartiates. Maintaining a population of physically capable and disciplined citizens was therefore a matter of strategic necessity. Any weakness in the population could compromise military readiness or invite rebellion from the helots. By implementing systematic policies of selection at birth, Sparta sought to maximize the probability that every child reaching adulthood would be strong, healthy, and capable of fulfilling the demanding role of a soldier or a mother of soldiers. The stakes, in the eyes of Spartan society, were existential. Beyond physical fitness, there was also a subtle eugenic dimension to these practices. The state implicitly encouraged certain genetic traits by privileging the survival of strong infants, thereby reinforcing the biological ideals of the Spartan warrior class over generations. While there was no formal understanding of genetics as we know it today, the practical effect was a selection process based on observable traits. In this way, Spartan society operated on principles that resemble modern eugenics, long before the concept existed in scientific or political discourse. It is a stark reminder of how deeply the militaristic and utilitarian mindset penetrated even the most intimate aspects of human life. It is important to note that while exposure and selective survival were common, they were also subject to some variation. Occasionally, infants deemed oomph. It might be taken in by relatives or sympathetic citizens, though such cases were rare. The system relied on collective enforcement, the authority of elders, the compliance of mothers, and the broader societal acceptance of harsh measures ensured the continuity of the practice. The normalization of infant exposure illustrates how cultural values and state authority can converge to produce policies that, from an outsider's perspective, appear profoundly inhumane. The Spartan approach to infants and birth also reflected a broader cultural obsession with the body as a marker of value. Physical perfection was equated with moral and civic worth. A strong body signified courage, resilience, and the potential to contribute to the perpetuation of Spartan society. Weakness, conversely, was not merely a private misfortune but a threat to the collective. This ideology shaped how families, elders, and the state perceived life at its earliest stage, reinforcing a worldview in which the individual was a means to an end, the end being the survival and supremacy of Sparta. Religious and ritual considerations also intersected with these practices. While the abandonment of infants may seem entirely pragmatic, there is evidence that rituals and religious ceremonies accompanied birth and inspection, integrating these procedures into the spiritual and civic fabric of Spartan life. In this way, the practice was not merely functional but morally and culturally sanctioned. By embedding these practices within ritual and tradition, the state ensured that citizens internalized the values of toughness, fitness, and loyalty to the collective from the very start of life. In conclusion, the Spartan approach to infants and birth reveals a society where the most fundamental human bonds, those between parent and child, were subordinated to the imperatives of state survival and military supremacy. NTs were not judged on their intrinsic value, but on their potential to contribute to the strength of the warrior class. Mothers were expected to produce healthy, capable offspring, and the state exercised control over the survival of children through inspection and exposure. These practices, though abhorrent to modern sensibilities, were consistent with the overarching Spartan ethos, a civilization in which every aspect of life, from birth to death, was measured by its utility to the state. Understanding these practices is crucial for comprehending the broader social and cultural mechanisms that made Sparta one of the most feared and unique city-states of ancient Greece, a society willing to shape life itself to serve the relentless demands of survival and military excellence. In Spartan society, marriage and reproduction were far more than personal or family matters. They were integral to the survival and military supremacy of the state. Unlike other Greek city-states, where marriage often revolved around social alliances, property, or personal relationships, in Sparta it was a deliberate state-influenced mechanism for producing strong citizens. Every aspect of courtship, marital arrangement, and childbearing was dictated by the overriding goal of maintaining a population of physically capable, disciplined, and loyal warriors. From adolescence to adulthood, both men and women were conditioned to view marriage as a civic duty rather than a private, emotional choice. Marriage in Sparta began at a younger age for women than for men, typically in the mid to late teens. Women were expected to be physically fit, and this was not just for their own health or appearance. It was to ensure the birth of robust children. The physical strength of Spartan women was considered essential as it directly affected the health and vitality of their offspring. Young women underwent IC training, including running, wrestling, and other exercises, which not only prepared them for motherhood but also instilled a sense of resilience and independence uncommon in other Greek societies. This emphasis on female fitness highlights the deeply utilitarian view of marriage and reproduction. Women were valued primarily for their ability to bear strong children who could grow into formidable warriors or mothers of warriors. Men, on the other hand, were immersed in the agoge, the rigorous military education system, until their mid-20s. As a result, they often married later than women, but their reproductive role was no less critical. Spartan men were expected to demonstrate exceptional physical and moral qualities, ensuring that the genetic material they contributed would strengthen future generations. Marriage was not solely a private union, but an arrangement sanctioned and influenced by the state, intended to produce the most capable offspring. In some cases, older men were paired with younger women based on assessments of physical fitness and potential genetic compatibility, reflecting a proto-eugenic approach to reproduction. These pairings were rarely about affection or love. They were a calculated strategy designed to perpetuate the Spartan ideal. The sexual and reproductive dynamics within Spartan marriages were also unique. There is evidence that men and women, although married, often maintained a degree of personal autonomy, with the state's primary interest being the production of healthy children rather than the emotional or sexual satisfaction of the partners. In some instances, Spartan men engaged in relationships with women outside their marriage if such unions were believed to increase the likelihood of producing strong offspring. Similarly, women were expected to remain physically fit and capable of bearing children well into their adult years. The focus on reproduction over personal preference or romantic attachment reflects the extreme utilitarianism of Spartan society. The family unit existed not for emotional fulfillment, but as a tool to sustain the state. Rituals and ceremonies surrounding marriage also reinforced the importance of reproduction in Spartan culture. Marriages often involved symbolic gestures emphasizing fertility, strength, and the continuity of the community. One notable practice involved the bride being led to the groom's home in a ritual that symbolized her transition into a role not just as a wife, but as a mother responsible for the next generation of warriors. The ceremonial aspects of marriage were designed to instill a sense of duty and civic responsibility, linking personal milestones to the broader needs of the state. Even the intimate act of reproduction was framed as a sacred duty to Sparta, binding individuals to the survival and perpetuation of their society from the very beginning of married life. Spartan law also regulated aspects of marriage to ensure that reproductive goals were met. While specific details are scarce due to the secretive nature of Spartan society, historical accounts suggest that the state maintained oversight of marriages to some degree, intervening when necessary to ensure that unions served the broader goal of producing capable offspring. This oversight extended to the timing of marriage and childbirth, with young couples expected to produce children in their prime years. The state's intervention into such personal matters may seem extreme from a modern perspective, but in the context of Sparta's existential concerns, it was considered both logical and necessary. Every citizen had a role to play, and the survival of the state depended on the careful management of reproduction. The expectations placed on women in particular were extraordinary. Unlike women in Athens or other Greek city-states, Spartan women could inherit property, exercise some degree of autonomy, and participate in physical training. However, all these rights and freedoms were linked directly to their reproductive responsibilities. Women were expected to bear strong children, and their fitness, health, and conduct were closely monitored. Pregnancy was not seen as a private matter, but as a state-sanctioned contribution to the military and civic strength of Sparta. Mothers were celebrated for producing healthy children, particularly sons who could become soldiers, but they were also expected to endure hardship and maintain physical resilience during pregnancy and childbirth, ensuring the best possible outcomes for the next generation. The reproductive expectations in Sparta also intersected with broader cultural ideals regarding discipline and sacrifice. Both men and women were conditioned to place the needs of the state above personal desires, and this ethos permeated every aspect of married life. Love and emotional attachment were secondary to civic duty, and personal preferences often yielded to state objectives. Children were conceived and raised not merely for family continuity, but as future defenders of Sparta, embodiments of the city-state's ideals and values. In this sense, marriage and reproduction were inseparable from the broader militaristic culture. They were instruments through which the state ensured its continuity, strength, and survival. Interestingly, Spartan society also allowed for some flexibility within these rigid expectations, particularly in terms of selecting mates. While the state emphasized physical and moral fitness, there are accounts suggesting that some choice was afforded to individuals, particularly in later adulthood. Men might seek women whose families had a history of producing healthy offspring, and men could exercise some discretion in partner selection based on social and familial considerations. However, these choices were always constrained by the overriding imperative of producing strong, capable children. Personal desires were subordinate to state interests, and the freedom individuals had was always measured against the needs of Sparta. The focus on reproductive outcomes had profound social consequences. Families were structured around the expectation of producing warriors and mothers of warriors, and parental bonds were often mediated by the state's goals. Children were valued not simply as individuals, but as future assets for the city-state, and the success of a family was measured by the fitness and capabilities of its offspring. This created a society in which personal emotions, familial attachment, and romantic love were frequently subordinated to utilitarian concerns. The human experience from birth to adulthood was thus intricately linked to the needs of the state, creating a culture in which reproductive success was synonymous with civic duty. Finally, the Spartan approach to marriage and reproduction reflects the extreme militarization of the society as a whole. Every decision, from who married whom to when and how children were conceived, was framed by the overarching goal of maintaining a disciplined, strong, and genetically robust population. This strategy, while effective in producing formidable soldiers and resilient citizens, came at a profound human cost. Personal freedoms, emotional bonds, and individual choice were all secondary to the imperatives of the state. In Spartan society, marriage was not simply a union between two people, it was a carefully orchestrated tool of civic engineering designed to sustain a warrior culture that valued strength, resilience, and loyalty above all else. In conclusion, marriage and reproductive expectations in Sparta reveal a society that viewed human relationships primarily through the lens of civic duty and military necessity. Both men and women were conditioned to prioritize the survival and strength of the state, and personal desires were secondary to societal imperatives. Women were celebrated for producing strong children, men were trained to father capable offspring, and the union of marriage was carefully regulated to ensure optimal reproductive outcomes. Through these practices, Sparta exemplified the extreme integration of family life and state objectives, demonstrating how deeply militaristic values could shape the most intimate and fundamental aspects of human existence. Spartan obsession with strength, discipline, and military supremacy did not end with infant inspections or carefully monitored marriages. Beyond individual households, the state itself took a direct role in controlling reproduction, implementing practices that were, by modern standards, highly disturbing. In Sparta, procreation was less a private act and more a tool of public policy, governed by an overarching system designed to maximize the production of healthy, capable citizens. This state control over breeding reflected Sparta's uncompromising utilitarian philosophy. The survival and dominance of the city-state were paramount, and human life was evaluated largely in terms of its contribution to that goal. One of the most striking aspects of Spartan breeding practices was the intentional pairing of individuals based on physical fitness, social standing, and perceived genetic potential. The state encouraged unions that would produce the strongest possible offspring. Plutarch, in his accounts of Sparta, notes that elders and magistrates sometimes assessed young couples and recommended pairings, particularly when the goal was to enhance the warrior class. This practice extended beo. Nd, merely arranging marriages, it reflected a deliberate, state-guided approach to eugenics centuries before the concept was formally theorized. Couples were not merely forming personal or familial bonds, they were fulfilling a civic duty, carefully selected to improve the quality of future generations. The state's influence over reproductive practices also included ritualized oversight and assessment. In some cases, Spartan men were encouraged to examine potential female partners for physical strength and health, while women's families might assess men for moral character and physical ability. Such evaluations, though conducted within the context of social and familial interactions, were guided by the principle of producing genetically robust offspring. Historical accounts suggest that these inspections were taken seriously, and compliance with such assessments was both expected and respected. This system of state-sanctioned selection demonstrates the degree to which the personal and private sphere in Sparta was subordinated to the needs of the city-state. In addition to selective pairings, the state also monitored sexual behavior to ensure that reproduction served civic ends. Marriage and sexual relations were largely tolerated or encouraged when they promised the birth of strong children, but were discouraged or even forbidden when they threatened the quality or quantity of the population. The state's interest in reproduction extended to its timing and outcomes. Young men and women were encouraged to conceive during their most physically productive years, and citizens were subtly guided in the frequency and purpose of sexual activity. These practices highlight the instrumental view of human intimacy. In Spartan society, sexual activity was primarily a means to an end, a tool for producing the next generation of warriors rather than a source of pleasure or personal fulfillment. One particularly controversial aspect of state-controlled breeding was the deliberate encouragement of unions intended to produce exceptional warriors. Plutarch records instances in which Spartan leaders promoted relationships between especially strong and capable men and women believed to have superior genetic traits. These arrangements were neither secret nor taboo. They were framed as patriotic and necessary acts, with the consent of the individuals involved often assumed as part of their civic duty. The goal was straightforward: to strengthen the population genetically and ensure the continuity of Sparta's military dominance. Such practices exemplify the extreme utilitarianism of the state, which prioritized the needs of the collective over the autonomy of individuals. The systemic nature of Spartan breeding control extended to the education and training of both men and women, reinforcing the state's reproductive agenda from an early age. Boys and girls were rigorously trained in physical conditioning, endurance, and resilience, ensuring that they would be fit for future reproductive roles. Girls were expected to maintain strength and health to produce robust offspring, while boys were groomed to become warriors whose physical and moral qualities would be passed on to the next generation. The entire social and educational framework of Sparta thus functioned as an extension of its reproductive policy, creating a culture in which the body, fitness, and reproductive potential were inseparable from civic identity. This state-directed approach to breeding also carried profound social and psychological consequences. By controlling who married whom, when they reproduced, and which children were permitted to survive, the state effectively diminished the autonomy of individuals. Personal choice was heavily constrained. Emotional attachments were secondary. Human relationships were often subordinated to the perceived needs of society. Citizens internalized these values from birth, understanding that their worth and the worth of their offspring was measured in terms of utility to the state. The normalization of such practices demonstrates how deeply militaristic and utilitarian thinking permeated Spartan life, transforming natural human experiences like love, marriage, and childbirth into tools of statecraft. Moreover, These breeding practices were tightly interwoven with the moral and ethical framework of Sparta. Strength, courage, and resilience were not only physical qualities, but also moral imperatives. Children born from carefully selected unions were expected to embody these traits fully, becoming disciplined warriors capable of serving the city-state effectively. The state did not merely shape the bodies of its citizens, it sought to shape their very character, ensuring that every new generation would contribute to the survival and glory of Sparta. In this way, reproduction, ethics, and civic duty were inseparable, creating a society in which personal identity was entirely intertwined with the needs of the collective. Historical sources indicate that the success of these practices was remarkable, at least in terms of producing a disciplined and effective military population. The combination of selective breeding, rigorous training, and strict socialization created generations of Spartans who were not only physically superior, but psychologically conditioned to endure hardship, suppress personal desire, and prioritize the state. This integration of biological, social, and cultural control over reproduction was unprecedented in the ancient world, marking Sparta as a society uniquely dedicated to the perfection of its citizen warriors. However, it also came at an extraordinary moral and human cost, as individuals were often reduced to instruments of state policy, their personal desires and attachments subordinated to the needs of the collective. The state-controlled breeding practices of Sparta also included measures to address potential weaknesses in the population. Infants or adults who displayed signs of frailty, illness, or incapacity were marginalized or eliminated from the reproductive equation. Exposure of unfit infants, discussed in earlier sections, can be seen as an early component of this broader policy which extended into adulthood through careful regulation of sexual and marital relationships. The logic was consistent. Any individual deemed incapable of contributing effectively to the survival of the state posed a potential threat to the collective and was therefore systematically removed from the reproductive pool. The influence of the state over reproduction even extended to legal and social pressures. Citizens who failed to marry appropriately, produce children, or meet the physical standards set by the state were subject to censure, loss of social status, or other sanctions. In extreme cases, individuals could be encouraged or pressured to leave the population entirely if they were deemed unfit to reproduce effectively. This social enforcement ensured compliance and reinforced the central message: reproduction was not a personal choice but a civic obligation, essential for the survival and dominance of Sparta. Finally, the state-controlled breeding practices highlight the intersection of politics, biology, and morality in Spartan society. Every aspect of human life from birth to death was evaluated in terms of its contribution to the military and civic strength of the city-state. The careful orchestration of reproduction, from the selection of mates to the timing and frequency of childbirth, exemplifies a society willing to manipulate its citizens' most intimate choices in service of a perceived higher purpose. These practices were not anomalies, but integral to the identity of Sparta, reflecting a worldview in which the collective, the state, and military necessity were valued above individual freedom, emotion, or moral hesitation. In conclusion, Spartan state-controlled breeding practices reveal a society that treated human reproduction as a matter of strategic importance rather than personal choice. The state intervened in mate selection, sexual behavior, and the timing of childbirth to ensure the production of healthy, capable citizens. Physical and moral fitness were rigorously assessed, and individuals were socialized to accept these interventions as necessary for the survival of the city-state. Through these measures, Sparta demonstrated a level of control over human life and reproduction unparalleled in the ancient world, creating a population of disciplined, resilient citizens while subordinating personal freedom and emotional bonds to the imperatives of survival and military supremacy. These practices, deeply embedded in Spartan culture, offer a chilling insight into a society where the state was the ultimate arbiter of human value and reproductive Worthwhile, the physical and structural aspects of Spartan breeding practices are both remarkable and disturbing. The long-term psychological and societal consequences of these policies were equally profound. Sparta was not merely a militaristic state, it was a society in which the very identity of its citizens was shaped by the relentless prioritization of the collective over the individual. From birth to adulthood, from marriage to reproduction, every facet of life was governed by the state, leaving deep and lasting effects on the minds, emotions, and social interactions of its people. The Spartan system offers a chilling example of how institutionalized social engineering can influence not only population health and military efficiency, but also the psychological makeup of an entire civilization. At the most fundamental level, the Spartan approach to life cultivated a detachment from personal emotions and familial attachment. From the inspection of infants to the exposure of those deemed unfit, citizens were conditioned to internalize the notion that human value was measured by utility to the state rather than individual traits or personal worth. Mothers, despite their relatively high social status and physical autonomy, were expected to accept a potential loss of children who failed these rigorous standards. Fathers, engaged in intense military training from a young age, were similarly socialized to suppress personal sentiment in favor of duty. This systematic devaluation of personal attachment and the elevation of civic duty above human relationships created a society in which emotional restraint was not only normal, but necessary for survival. It also reinforced a collective identity in which loyalty to the state superseded all other bonds. The psychological conditioning began in early childhood and extended through the agoge, Sparta's state-run education and military training system. Boys were removed from their families at the age of 7 and placed into rigorous communal training programs designed to instill discipline, endurance, and fearlessness. They were taught to endure pain, hunger, and physical hardship, all while fostering loyalty to their peers and to the state. The agoge did not merely train bodies, it molded minds, creating individuals who could internalize and accept the harsh realities of Spartan reproductive policies, child exposure, and strict societal hierarchies. Children learned that their own lives, and the lives of others, were instruments of state policy, cultivating a mindset in which personal desire was secondary to collective necessity. Spartan women, too, were deeply affected psychologically by the state's reproductive mandates. Though afforded greater freedom and physical agency than their counterparts in other Greek city-states, their autonomy was tied to their ability to produce strong offspring. The pressure to bear children who met the rigorous physical and moral standards of the Spartan state created an environment in which reproductive performance was a central component of identity. Success or failure as a mother was socially and culturally significant, influencing not only personal esteem but also social status. The emotional toll of knowing that one's children could be subjected to inspection and potential exposure undoubtedly weighed on Spartan women, reinforcing a culture of resilience, stoicism, and emotional discipline. Beyond individual psychology, Spartan breeding practices had significant societal implications. By institutionalizing the exposure of unfit infants and state-influenced mate selection, Sparta cultivated a culture in which the community was constantly aware of the hierarchy of value. Citizens were acutely aware that their physical, moral, and reproductive qualities were constantly measured against the needs of the state. This knowledge reinforced conformity, obedience, and competitiveness as individuals sought to align themselves with societal ideals. It also promoted a form of social Darwinism, in which the strong were celebrated and the weak were marginalized or eliminated, creating an intensely stratified and disciplined population. The emphasis on collective survival over individual welfare also contributed to a form of psychological resilience, albeit one rooted in rigidity and fearlessness rather than flexibility or empathy. Spartans were conditioned to face extreme hardship, both personally and in observing the harsh treatment of others, without succumbing to despair or moral conflict. Exposure to these practices normalized what might otherwise be considered cruel or unnatural behavior, fostering a mindset in which harshness and utilitarianism were acceptable, even virtuous if they served the state. In this way, the psychological conditioning inherent in Spartan society was deeply intertwined with its social and reproductive policies, creating a populace capable of both extreme discipline and unquestioning loyalty. The societal consequences of these breeding practices extended to the structure of families and communities. Spartan households were organized not merely around affection or domestic needs, but around their role in producing and raising future citizens. Children were viewed as assets of the state, and their upbringing was shaped by the expectation that they would fulfill specific civic and military roles. Familial bonds, while present, were filtered through the lens of civic responsibility. This reconfiguration of family life had the dual effect of strengthening communal cohesion and diminishing individual autonomy, as personal desires were constantly subordinated to state needs. It also reinforced the perception that human life was a resource, evaluated for its potential contribution rather than its inherent value. From a broader societal perspective, the breeding practices of Sparta helped maintain a stable yet highly controlled population. By removing those deemed unfit and guiding the reproductive choices of citizens, the state ensured that its military and civic class remained physically strong and socially disciplined. This approach contributed to Sparta's remarkable longevity as a militaristic power in the Greek world, but it also entrenched social rigidity. Opportunities for social mobility were limited, personal freedom was constrained, and the entire society was structured around a narrowly defined ideal of human worth. In essence, Sparta achieved remarkable efficiency and cohesion at the cost of human individuality and emotional richness. There were also long-term cultural implications. By embedding reproductive control into the core of Spartan identity, the state reinforced a worldview in which strength, resilience, and obedience were supreme virtues. Ethical considerations such as compassion, empathy, and the protection of the vulnerable were subordinated to civic necessity. Over generations, these values became internalized, shaping not only behavior but moral reasoning. Spartans learned to equate utility with value, creating a society in which cruelty, rigidity, and utilitarian logic were normalized and even celebrated. This cultural conditioning ensured that the extreme measures taken to control reproduction were both sustainable and self-reinforcing, becoming an unquestioned element of Spartan life. The psychological impact of these practices also extended to intergenerational relationships. Children who survived exposure and rigorous selection processes were raised to expect a world in which weakness was punished and strength rewarded. This created a continuous cycle of conditioning. Each generation internalized the values and expectations of the previous one, reinforcing the social and psychological framework necessary to sustain the militaristic and reproductive policies of the state. Emotional detachment, resilience, and obedience became hallmarks of Spartan character, traits that were essential for maintaining the cohesion and dominance of the city-state over centuries. Finally, the legacy of these psychological and societal impacts illustrates a paradox at the heart of Spartan society. The very practices that ensured military supremacy, population strength, and social cohesion also imposed profound constraints on personal freedom, emotional richness, and human empathy. Spartans were remarkably disciplined and resilient, but their society achieved these qualities through the normalization of practices that modern observers would consider ethically troubling. In this sense, the psychological and societal impact of Spartan breeding practices is inseparable from the state's militaristic ethos. The creation of an elite warrior society demanded sacrifices not only of the weak, but of human individuality, intimacy, and moral flexibility. In conclusion, the psychological and societal impact of Spartan breeding practices was profound and multifaceted. From birth to adulthood, citizens were conditioned to prioritize the needs of the state over personal desire, emotional attachment, or individual freedom. Families were organized around civic duty and reproductive performance, while children were socialized to internalize the harsh realities of state control. Over generations, these practices fostered a population that was disciplined, resilient, and loyal, yet constrained in emotional expression. On moral flexibility and personal autonomy. The Spartan system demonstrates how deeply state control over reproduction can shape the psyche and culture of a society, producing a population optimized for survival and military efficiency, but at the cost of individuality, empathy, and personal liberty. In understanding these impacts, we gain insight into both the remarkable strengths and the disturbing human costs of one of history's most extreme militaristic societies.